The longships cut through the grey waters like wolves through winter fog. 1,000 Vikings stood behind Lagertha, their breath forming clouds in the cold dawn air, their shields painted with the colours of a dozen clans united under one banner. She stood at the prow of the lead vessel, her hand resting on the carved dragon head that rose from the timber, her eyes scanning the distant shoreline where smoke still rose from burning villages. The wind carried salt and ash. Behind her, the warriors were silent, not with fear, but with the kind of reverence reserved for moments when fate sharpened its blade. They had followed her across 3 kingdoms, through blood and snow, because she had never asked them to go where she would not lead. Her name was sung in mead halls, from the frozen north to the green valleys of the south. Lagertha, the unbroken. Lagertha, the shield maiden. Lagertha, who had stood against earls and kings and carved her legend into the very bones of the earth. But something was wrong. The enemy fleet waited ahead, anchored in the bay like a dark promise. Their numbers were fewer, their ships smaller, yet they did not retreat. They did not even raise their weapons. Instead, a single figure stood at the bow of the central vessel, arms spread wide, head thrown back as if welcoming the sun. Even from this distance, Lagertha could see the figure was a woman, clad in leather and iron, her hair wild in the wind. The woman's voice carried across the water, impossibly clear, impossibly certain. Lagertha, just her name. Nothing more, but the sound of it, spoken with such intimate knowing, such quiet triumph, sent ice down her spine. Around her the warriors shifted, confused. How did this stranger know their commander's name? Why did she speak it? Like a secret, like a curse, like a key turning in a lock that should never have been opened. Lagertha's fingers tightened on the dragon's carved mane. Her heart, which had remained steady through 100 battles, through sieges and storms and the deaths of friends, now beat with something she had almost forgotten: uncertainty. Not fear. She had carved fear from her chest years ago, but something deeper, something that whispered of threads she had not seen, of debts she had not remembered owing. The woman across the water lowered her arms and smiled. Even from here, Lagertha could see that smile. It was not cruel, it was not mocking. It was sad. And that, somehow, was worse than any war cry could have been. Before we continue this journey, subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Your strength keeps these legends alive. 3 winters earlier, Lagertha had been a different woman. Or perhaps she had simply forgotten what it meant to be a woman at all, having worn armor for so long that it had become a second skin. She led a war band of 300 then, sellswords and outcasts, men and women who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose. They fought for jarls who paid in silver and land, for lords who needed battles won but did not want to dirty their own hands with the winning. It was good work. Clean work in its way. You knew where you stood. You knew who your enemies were. You killed or you died, and the gods watched from their halls and judged you worthy or wanting. But that winter, everything changed because of a child. They had been hired to break a siege, to drive back a rival earl's forces from a fortified village on the edge of the northern forests. The battle had been swift and brutal, ending before nightfall, with the enemy scattered and the village saved. Lagertha's warriors celebrated in the great hall that night, drinking the Lord's mead and boasting of their kills. But she had walked alone through the village streets, needing the cold air to clear the blood smell from her lungs. That was when she heard the crying, a small sound, barely louder than the wind through the thatch roofs. She followed it to a collapsed home on the village's edge, its walls blackened by fire, its roof caved in. Among the rubble she found a girl no more than 6 winters old, clutching a burned doll and weeping silently, the kind of crying that came when you had no tears left, but your body remembered how. Lagertha knelt in the ash. The girl looked up at her with eyes too old for her face, eyes that had seen things no child should see. There was blood on her dress. Not her own, Lagertha realized. Her parents, her family's. "What is your name?" Lagertha had asked, her voice gentler than she thought it could still be. The girl said nothing. She only stared, clutching that ruined doll like it was the last solid thing in a world turned to smoke. Lagertha should have walked away, should have left the child for the village women to care for, should have returned to her warriors and her silver and her next contract. But something in that small face, something broken and defiant all at once, made her stay, made her reach out and lift the girl from the ruins, made her carry her back to the hall, made her tell her warriors that this one was under her protection now. They called the girl Astrid because she had forgotten her own name. Or perhaps she had never wanted to remember it. For 2 years, Astrid travelled with the warband. She learned to mend armour and sharpen blades, to read the weather and the faces of men planning treachery. She learned to be silent when silence was needed, and to laugh when laughter was the only shield against darkness. And Lagertha, who had buried her own capacity for softness long ago, found it growing back, like spring grass through snow. But Astrid never spoke. Not once in those 2 years, not a single word, until the night she disappeared. It happened during the campaign against Jarl Eriksson, a brutal lord who ruled the eastern shores with fire and fear. Lagertha's warband had been hired by a coalition of smaller lords to break his power, to free the villages he had enslaved, and return the land to those who worked it. It was a just cause as any cause could be when it involved killing, and Lagertha's warriors fought with the fury of people who believed for once that their blades served something more than silver. They made camp in a valley between 2 raids, a temporary respite to tend the wounded and sharpen their weapons. Lagertha had set guards around the perimeter and settled by the fire with her captains, planning the next assault. Astrid had been there, sitting at the edge of the firelight as she always did, watching everything with those 2 old eyes. Then came the scream, not a battle cry, not a death scream, something worse, a sound of pure terror abruptly cut off. Lagertha and her warriors ran toward the sound, weapons drawn, expecting ambush. They found only an empty clearing at the camp's edge, the grass trampled, a single small shoe lying on its side in the dirt. Astrid was gone. They searched through the night and into the next day. They questioned every warrior, every camp follower, every prisoner they held. They combed the forest and the cliffs and the shore. They found no body, no blood trail, no sign of struggle beyond that trampled grass and abandoned shoe. It was as if the earth had opened and swallowed the girl whole. Lagertha drove her warriors like never before. She offered gold, land, freedom to any who could find Astrid. She sent riders to every village, every hall, every market. Within 10 days' ride, she interrogated travelers and traders and hermits living in caves. She even consulted a Völva, an old seeress who read the bones and spoke in riddles. But the woman only shook her head and said, "Some threads are cut by scissors we cannot see. Some paths lead to places the gods themselves do not name." After 3 weeks, her captains urged her to move on. The war against Jarl Eriksson still needed fighting. The contract still needed honoring. The living needed leading. So Lagertha led. But something in her had fractured. Something had gone quiet and cold, like a fire, that still burned but gave no warmth. She won the war against Eriksson, broke his forces at the Battle of Raven's Ford, saw him flee into exile with a handful of loyal men. She collected her silver and her glory. She grew her warband from 300 to 1,000. She became legend, but she never stopped searching. In every village, in every hall, in every crowd, her eyes scanned for a small face, a silent girl, a lost child who might have somehow survived. And she never found her, until today, until that voice across the water, speaking her name with such terrible knowing. The fleets drew closer. Lagertha's warriors raised their shields, prepared for arrows, for fire, for whatever trap this was. But no arrows came, no fire. The enemy ships simply waited, and that woman at the prow stood motionless, watching Lagertha, with eyes that seemed to see through armor, through reputation, through time itself. When the longships came within speaking distance, the woman raised her hand, a gesture not of threat but of parley. Her voice carried clear and strong across the narrowing gap. "I am Thyra. I speak for Jarl Eriksson, who lives yet, who remembers you, who sends this message. Come to the shore alone, or the blood of 1,000 will stain these waters before sunset." Lagertha's second, a grizzled warrior named Bjorn, who had fought at her side for 8 years, stepped forward. "It's a trap. They want you isolated. We take them now, overwhelm their numbers." "No." Lagertha's voice was quiet, but absolute. "I will go. Commander, if they wanted me dead, I would be dead already. They have something else planned." She looked at Thyra across the water, at that sad smile that had not wavered. "Something worse than death." She ordered her fleet to hold position, then took a small rowboat alone toward the shore. Her warriors watched in tense silence as she rowed across the gap, each stroke of the oars deliberate and steady. She was aware of every weapon pointed at her, every eye tracking her movement. She was aware of how easy it would be to die here, how simple it would be for an arrow to end the legend of Lagertha the Unbroken. But she was also aware of something else, a strange, sick certainty that whatever waited on that shore, she had to face it, that this moment had been coming since that night Astrid vanished, that the threads the Völva had spoken of were finally pulling tight. She reached the shore and stepped onto the sand. Thyra was there, waiting, flanked by a dozen warriors but making no move to attack. Up close, Lagertha could see the woman was perhaps 30 winters old, scarred and battle-worn, with eyes that held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much and surviving it anyway. "Walk with me," Thyra said, and turned toward the tree line without waiting for an answer. Lagertha followed, one hand on her sword hilt, scanning for ambush. They walked in silence through the trees until they reached a small clearing where a camp had been made. Not a war camp, but something smaller, more careful. At its center, sitting on a log by a dying fire, was Jarl Eriksson. The man looked nothing like the warlord Lagertha remembered. He had been powerful once, broad-shouldered and fierce-eyed, the kind of man who commanded rooms. With his voice alone, now he looked shrunken, his hair grey, his face lined with pain that had nothing to do with his exile. He looked up when Lagertha approached, and his eyes held no anger, no hatred, only exhaustion. "Lagertha," he said, his voice like wind through dead leaves. "Thank you for coming." She said nothing, waited. "I have something of yours," Eriksson continued. "Something I have carried for 3 years, something that has destroyed my sleep and poisoned my days, something I can carry no longer." He gestured, and from the shadows of the camp, a figure emerged. Lagertha's breath stopped. It was Astrid. She was older now, of course she was older. 3 years had passed, but it was unmistakably her. The same eyes, darker now, harder but the same way of holding herself, half defiant, half broken. She wore simple clothes, not warrior's garb, and her hands were empty of weapons. She did not run to Lagertha, did not smile, did not cry. She simply stood there, watching the woman who had once carried her from the ashes, and her expression was unreadable. Lagertha wanted to speak, wanted to run to her, wanted to weep and rage and demand answers all at once. But her body had gone rigid, her warrior's discipline the only thing keeping her upright. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "How?" Eriksson stood, moving like a man much older than his years. "That night you came for me, the night you broke my forces at Raven's Ford, I had already lost. I knew it. My warriors knew it. So I did the only thing a desperate man could do. I took something you loved, hoping to trade it for my life, hoping to negotiate some mercy from the woman who showed no mercy. You took her." Lagertha's voice was hollow. "You stole a child." "I did, and I have regretted it every day since." Eriksson looked at Astrid, and there was genuine pain in his face. "But by the time I realized what I had done, by the time I understood the weight of it, you had already won. I was in exile, hunted, with nowhere to go and no one to trust. So I kept her, raised her, protected her in my way." "Protected her?" Lagertha's hand tightened on her sword. "You enslaved her." "No," the voice was Astrid's. Quiet, clear, the first words Lagertha had ever heard her speak. He saved me. Lagertha turned to her, unable to comprehend. Astrid stepped forward, her face still, unreadable. The night he took me, I was planning to run away, to walk into the sea and let the water take me, because I couldn't bear it anymore. Couldn't bear seeing you fight and bleed and risk everything while I sat useless, while I watched you become harder and colder, while I knew it was my fault, because I couldn't speak, because I was broken. You were a child. I was a burden. Astrid's voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. And when Eriksson's men took me, I was almost grateful, because it meant you could stop searching. It meant you could stop destroying yourself trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. As fate turns against our hero, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's see how far these voices can travel. Lagertha stood frozen, the world tilting beneath her feet. Everything she had believed for 3 years, every sleepless night, every desperate search, every moment of guilt and rage, suddenly inverted, became something else entirely. She had thought herself the savior, the protector, the one who had failed to keep a child safe. But Astrid had seen her as the one who needed saving. He didn't hurt me, Astrid continued, her voice gaining strength. Eriksson, he was broken too in his way. He had lost his own daughter years before, in a raid he couldn't stop, and I think seeing me reminded him of her. So he kept me safe, fed me, taught me, and when I finally spoke, when I finally told him who I was and who you were, he wept. Eriksson nodded, his face grey with exhaustion. I knew then that I had to return her, that carrying this weight would destroy me, that I had already destroyed too much, but I couldn't simply send her back, couldn't trust messengers, couldn't trust that she wouldn't be taken again by someone else. So I waited, watched, and when I heard you had gathered 1,000 warriors, when I heard you were sailing for the northern kingdoms, I knew this was my chance. Your chance. Lagertha's voice was ice. You think you can just return her and walk away? You think I don't expect forgiveness, Eriksson interrupted. I don't expect mercy. I expect nothing but the death I have earned. But before I die, I needed you to know the truth. I needed you to know that Astrid lived, that she survived, that she is whole, because you deserve that knowledge, even if you deserve nothing else from me. He drew a knife from his belt, not in threat, but in offering. He held it out to Lagertha, hilt first. My life is yours. It has always been yours. Since the day you broke my armies, I have simply been too cowardly to surrender it until now. Lagertha looked at the knife, at Eriksson, at Astrid, who watched them both with those impossibly old eyes. Her hand trembled with rage, with grief, with something too tangled to name. Every instinct screamed at her to take the knife, to end this man who had stolen 3 years from her, who had let her suffer thinking Astrid was dead, or worse. But Astrid stepped forward, placed her hand over Eriksson's, gently lowering the knife. He saved my life, she said quietly, not just from his own men, but from myself. He gave me something I didn't have with you, not because you failed, but because you were too strong. You were a warrior. Lagertha, a legend, and I was just a broken girl who reminded you of something you had lost. With him, I could be weak. I could heal. I searched for you, Lagertha whispered, her voice breaking. I searched everywhere, I know, and that's why I had to let you stop. Astrid's eyes finally filled with tears. Because if you had found me, you would have kept searching forever. You would have kept trying to fix me, to make me whole, and you would have destroyed yourself in the process. Sometimes, Lagertha, the strongest thing a warrior can do is let something go. The clearing was silent, except for the wind through the trees and the distant sound of warriors waiting, weapons ready, for orders that hadn't come. Lagertha stood between the man who had stolen her hope and the girl who had become that hope's embodiment, and felt the weight of her 1,000 spears pressing against her back, like expectation made solid. What did a warrior do when violence was no longer the answer, when the enemy offered his throat and the victory felt hollow, when the child you had grieved was alive but no longer needed saving? Thyra, who had stood silent throughout, finally spoke. Eriksson is dying. The wasting sickness. He has perhaps a moon left, maybe less. He knows this. That's why we're here. He wanted to return what he took before the gods called him to account. Lagertha looked at Eriksson, really looked at him and saw the truth of it. The grey pallor, the tremor in his hands, the way he held himself like a man already halfway to the next world. "So this is your redemption?" she asked. "Giving back what you stole when you have nothing left to lose?" "No." Ericsson's voice was firm. "Redemption is a gift I don't deserve and won't ask for. This is simply the right thing to do. The only right thing I have done in years. Let it be enough." Astrid stepped closer to Lagertha, close enough that she could have reached out and touched the woman who had once carried her from the flames. But she didn't. The distance between them felt like a chasm carved by years and choices and pain. "I'm not asking you to forgive him," Astrid said. "I'm not even asking you to forgive me for staying away. I'm asking you to let this end, to let him die in peace, to let me find my own path, not as your lost child, but as someone who chooses her own destiny." "And what destiny is that?" Lagertha asked, her voice rough. "I don't know yet, but I know it's not following you into battle after battle, watching you bleed for causes that never end. I know it's not trying to become what I can never be, a warrior like you. I need to find out who Astrid is when she's not living in Lagertha's shadow." Each word was a blade, carefully placed, cutting through the myths Lagertha had built around the girl she thought she had saved. She had imagined this reunion 1,000 times, imagined Astrid running to her, imagined tears of joy, imagined picking up where they had left off. She had never imagined this. A quiet rejection, delivered with love but no less final for it. Behind her she could hear her warriors growing restless. They expected their commander to act, to decide, to lead. They had followed her here for glory and vengeance, not for this strange, painful surrender. But Lagertha had spent 3 years learning that some battles couldn't be won with swords. She took a long breath, tasting salt and pine and ash. Then she turned to Eriksson. "Go," she said simply. "Take your warriors and disappear into whatever corner of the world will have you. Die in peace, if peace is what you seek. But know this, if any of your men ever raise a blade in cruelty again, if any child suffers because you were too weak to stop it, I will find you in whatever hall the gods gave you and drag you back to pay that debt." Eriksson bowed his head, accepting the terms. Lagertha turned to Astrid. "And you, if you need anything, protection, resources, simply a place to rest, send word. I won't come looking for you. I won't try to shape you into something you're not, but you will always be under my shield, whether you want it or not." Astrid nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. "Thank you. For what?" "For letting me go." Lagertha walked back through the trees alone, her footsteps heavy, her heart heavier. She could hear the camp behind her breaking apart, Eriksson's warriors preparing to slip away into exile, Astrid choosing a path that didn't include the woman who had once saved her. Every step felt like lifting stones, like wading through deep water. When she emerged from the tree line, her 1,000 warriors were waiting on the beach, shields raised, ready for battle. Bjorn stood at their head, his face grim with anticipation. "What are your orders, Commander?" he called as she approached. Lagertha looked at them. Her warriors, her legends in the making, her 1,000 spears that had followed her across kingdoms and seas. They expected glory. They expected blood and victory and songs to be sung. They expected her to be Lagertha the Unbroken, who never hesitated, who never showed weakness, who never let anything stand between her and her purpose. But standing before them now, she felt the weight of that legend like chains. "We're leaving," she said. "The enemy has fled. There's nothing here to fight." Confusion rippled through the ranks. Bjorn stepped forward. "But the girl is safe, is whole, is none of your concern." Her voice was steel, brooking no argument. "We came here to fight an enemy. The enemy is gone. We're done." "Done!" A younger warrior, hot-blooded and eager, pushed forward. "We sailed for weeks for this. We left battles and glory behind for this. And you're telling us to just leave?" Lagertha turned to face him, and the weight of her gaze silenced him immediately. But when she spoke, her voice was not angry, it was tired. "Yes, I'm telling you to leave, because sometimes the greatest battles are the ones we choose. Not to fight, Sometimes strength is knowing when the sword does more harm than good, and if you can't understand that, then you've learned nothing from following me." She walked past them, toward the longships, and after a moment, her warriors followed. They filed onto the vessels in silence, confused and disappointed, muttering among themselves about the anticlimactic end to their great journey. Some looked at their commander with new doubt in their eyes. Others simply accepted it, trusting that Lagertha the Unbroken knew things they didn't. But as the ships pulled away from shore, as the oars bit into the grey water and carried them back toward the open sea, Lagertha stood at the prow again and let herself finally feel it. The grief, the relief, the strange hollowness of an ending that wasn't an ending at all. Bjorn came to stand beside her. He said nothing for a long time, just watched the shore recede, watched the small figures on the beach growing smaller until they were dots. Then nothing. "You made the right choice," he finally said. "Did I?" Lagertha's voice was barely audible over the wind. "You let her choose her own path. That's more than most would have done." Or, "I failed her again. Failed to fight for her. Failed to bring her home." Bjorn shook his head. "Home isn't a place you drag someone to. It's a place they choose to return to. And if she chooses to find you again one day, she'll know you'll be there. That's enough." Lagertha said nothing, but she reached up and touched the pendant around her neck, a small piece of carved bone that Astrid had made years ago, when she still couldn't speak, when her only way of communicating was through the things she created. Lagertha had worn it every day since the girl disappeared, a reminder of what she had lost. She didn't take it off now, but she understood, perhaps for the first time, that what she had lost wasn't Astrid. It was the illusion that she could protect everyone, save everyone, fix everyone with nothing but strength and stubbornness. Some things she was learning couldn't be fixed with a sword. 3 days into the journey home, the storm hit. It came from the north like the god's fury made manifest, waves rising higher than the masts, wind tearing at sails and oars, rain so thick it turned the world to grey chaos. Lagertha's fleet scattered, each ship fighting its own battle against the sea, warriors who had faced armies now clinging to ropes and praying to whatever gods would listen. Lagertha lashed herself to the mast of the lead ship, refusing to go below even as her warriors begged her to seek shelter. She stood against the wind, her hair whipping around her face, her eyes searching the storm as if daring it to take her. And in the heart of that chaos, when the thunder drowned out thought and the lightning made the world a series of frozen moments, she understood something. She had been wrong about Astrid. Not wrong to care, not wrong to search, but wrong about what the girl had needed. She had projected her own strength onto someone who needed something different. She had tried to make Astrid into a warrior because that was the only way Lagertha knew how to survive, the only way she knew how to matter. But Astrid had taught her something in that clearing, that there were other kinds of strength, that healing wasn't cowardice, that choosing peace wasn't surrender, that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was admit you couldn't fix something with violence. The storm raged for 2 days. When it finally broke, the fleet regrouped, counting their losses. 3 ships had sunk. 50 warriors had been taken by the sea. It was a heavy price, but they had survived, and Lagertha, standing among her exhausted warriors, felt something shift inside her chest, something that had been frozen for years beginning to thaw. They returned to their stronghold on the coast, a fortified hall overlooking the sea, where Lagertha's warband made their home between contracts. Her warriors dispersed to rest and recover, to drink and tell stories of the strange journey that had ended without battle, without glory, without the clean satisfaction of victory. But Lagertha didn't join them. She climbed the cliffs above the hall, alone, and sat on the edge where the land met the endless sky. She watched the sun set over the water, painting the world in gold and crimson, and thought about the paths that had led her here. She had been 12 winters old when her village was raided, when she watched her mother die defending their home, when she picked up a sword for the first time and discovered she had a talent for survival. She had been 16 when she left to join her first warband, 19 when she killed her first man in single combat, 23 when she led her first raid. Every year had hardened her, shaped her, turned her into the legend that others whispered about. But what had that legend cost her? What had she sacrificed to become Lagertha the Unbroken? She thought of Astrid's words. Sometimes the strongest thing a warrior can do is let something go. She thought of the 1,000 warriors who followed her, who looked to her for purpose and direction. What was she leading them toward? More battles, more blood, more hollow victories that left them strong but empty. As the last light faded from the sky, Lagertha made a decision. The next morning, she called her warband together in the great hall. They assembled, expecting news of the next contract, the next war, the next chance to prove their strength. Instead, Lagertha stood before them and spoke words she had never imagined saying. "I'm dissolving the warband." Silence. Shock. Then a roar of confusion and protest. She raised her hand, commanding silence, and eventually they gave it to her, because even in this, they trusted her enough to listen. "We've fought for jarls and kings, for silver and glory, for causes both just and unjust. We've become legends, but legends aren't enough anymore. I've realized that strength without purpose is just violence in pretty armor, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life bleeding for people who will forget my name the moment I'm no longer useful." She looked around at the faces she had fought beside, bled beside, survived beside. "I'm not abandoning you, I'm freeing you. Each of you has a choice now. You can take your share of the silver we've earned and go wherever your path leads, or you can stay with me and help me build something new. Not a warband, but a haven, a place where those who have nowhere else to go can find shelter, where children like Astrid can heal instead of break, where warriors can choose to lay down their swords without shame." Bjorn stepped forward. "You want to build a sanctuary? You, Lagertha the Unbroken, who has never retreated from a fight in her life?" She smiled, and it was tired but genuine. "Maybe that's exactly why I need to. Maybe I've spent so long proving I couldn't be broken that I forgot there are other ways to be strong." In the end, 300 of her 1,000 warriors chose to stay. The others took their silver and sailed off to find new battles, new glories, new legends to write. Lagertha watched them go without regret, understanding now that everyone had to choose their own path. Those who remained helped her transform the stronghold. They built a school where children could learn not just to fight, but to read, to build, to heal. They opened their gates to refugees from wars and raids, to those fleeing tyrants and disasters. They trained warriors, yes, but they also trained healers and craftspeople and storytellers. It was harder than any battle Lagertha had ever fought. It required patience instead of fury, wisdom instead of strength, the willingness to fail and try again, instead of winning through sheer force of will. There were days when she doubted, when she wondered if she had made the wrong choice, when the itch to return to simpler times, to the clarity of sword and shield, nearly overwhelmed her. But then she would see a child learning to read, or a former slave learning a trade, or a warrior learning to smile again, and she understood that this was her real legacy. Not the battles she had won, but the lives she had helped rebuild. 3 years after she had dissolved the warband, a ship arrived at her harbor. Lagertha was in the courtyard, teaching a group of young students how to defend themselves, not how to attack, not how to kill, but how to survive. When one of her guards ran to tell her a visitor had come, she walked to the dock, and her heart stopped. It was Astrid, the girl, no, the young woman, now stepped off the ship alone, carrying a pack on her back and a quiet determination in her eyes. She looked at the stronghold, at the children playing in the courtyard, at the people coming and going with purpose and hope in their faces, and something like wonder crossed her expression. "I heard what you were building," Astrid said when Lagertha reached her. "I heard that Lagertha the Unbroken had become Lagertha the Shield. I wanted to see if it was true." "And is it?" Lagertha asked, her voice catching. Astrid looked at her, really looked at her, and smiled. It's more than true. It's beautiful. They stood there on the dock, the water lapping at the posts, the sounds of the sanctuary drifting across the air. All the words that had been left unsaid 3 years ago hung between them, heavy and light all at once. "I don't need you to save me anymore," Astrid finally said, "but I would like to help you save others, if you'll have me." Lagertha felt tears sting her eyes, tears she hadn't allowed herself in decades, tears that spoke of grief and joy, and the strange, painful beauty of letting go just enough to let something new grow. "I would like that," she said. "I would like that very much." They walked together up from the dock toward the stronghold that had become something neither of them had expected, a home built not on conquest, but on choice, not on strength, but on compassion, not on the legends of who they had been, but on the possibility of who they could become. Behind them, the sea continued its eternal rhythm, carrying away the old stories and bringing in new ones with each tide. Years passed, and the sanctuary grew. What had begun as a single fortified hall became a small village, then a town, then something that had no name because it was unlike anything the northern kingdoms had ever seen. People came from across the seas, some fleeing war, some seeking purpose, some simply drawn by the stories of a place where warriors laid down their swords not in defeat, but in wisdom. Lagertha aged, as all legends must. Her hair turned silver, her hands grew lined with scars and time. Her body moved with the careful deliberation of one who had pushed it too hard for too long. But her eyes remained sharp, and her presence still commanded rooms without needing to demand them. Astrid became the sanctuary's voice to the outside world, traveling to kingdoms and halls to negotiate treaties, to arrange safe passage for refugees, to convince jarls and kings that peace could be more profitable than war. Where Lagertha had once used steel to open doors, Astrid used words and proved them just as effective, just as powerful, just as capable of changing the world. Bjorn became the sanctuary's protector, training a new kind of warrior, one who knew when to fight and when to shield, when to draw steel and when to extend an open hand. He was harder than Astrid, gentler than Lagertha, and together the three of them formed something balanced and strong. Other members of the original warband found their own roles. Some became teachers, some became farmers, some left and returned multiple times, unable to fully abandon the old ways, but drawn back by what the sanctuary represented. Thyra, the woman who had called Lagertha's name across the water that fateful day, arrived 2 years after Astrid. She had stayed with Eriksson until his death, then wandered aimlessly until she heard rumors of the sanctuary and decided to see if redemption was something that could be earned through service rather than suffering. The sanctuary had no walls. That was Lagertha's first rule. "If we build walls," she said, "we're just creating another fortress, another place people need to break into or break out of. Let us be open. Let us trust that people will choose to stay because of what we offer, not because they're trapped." It was a radical idea, a dangerous one, and yet somehow it worked. There were challenges, of course. Raiders came twice in the early years, thinking the sanctuary easy prey. They found instead that while Lagertha had taught her people to choose peace, she had not taught them to be helpless. The raiders were repelled both times, not slaughtered but driven off, and then offered shelter if they chose to lay down their weapons and join the community. Some did, most didn't. But word spread that the sanctuary was not weakness disguised as compassion, but strength, choosing a different path. There were disputes within the community, clashes of culture and belief, as people from different kingdoms learned to live together. There were those who chafed under the sanctuary's rules, who wanted hierarchy and clear leadership, who couldn't understand a place that valued questions over answers. Some of these people left. Others learned to sit with discomfort, to grow through friction rather than flee from it. And there were moments of profound beauty. The first harvest festival, when warriors and refugees and children all worked together to bring in the crops. The winter, when illness swept through, and everyone, regardless of status, took turns nursing the sick. The day a former slave stood before the community and spoke about her journey from bondage to freedom, her voice strong and certain, her story a testament to what was possible when people chose to see each other's humanity. Lagertha watched it all with a mixture of pride and humility. This wasn't her sanctuary, she often said. It belonged to everyone who chose to be part of it, who chose to build something rather than tear down, who chose to believe that another way was possible. But late at night, when the halls were quiet and the fires burned low, she would sometimes walk alone to the cliffs above the sea and think about the girl she had been, the girl who had picked up a sword and learned to survive through violence, who had built a legend on blood and battle, who had thought strength meant never breaking. She thought about the woman she had become, still strong, but in a different way, still a warrior, but fighting different battles, still Lagertha, but no longer needing to be unbroken to matter. And she thought about Astrid, asleep in the hall below, no longer a silent child clutching a burned doll, but a woman, with her own voice, her own strength, her own story, that had been shaped by, but not defined, by the woman who had once carried her from the ashes. On the morning of her 61st winter, Lagertha woke knowing that her time was drawing short. There was no pain, no illness, simply the bone-deep certainty that comes when a life has been lived fully and is reaching its natural conclusion. She rose, dressed in simple clothes rather than armor, and walked through the sanctuary one last time. She visited the school and watched children learning their letters, their faces bright with concentration. She visited the workshop and saw craftspeople creating beauty from wood and metal and clay. She visited the healing house and spoke with those recovering from wounds, both physical and spiritual. She visited the training yard and watched Bjorn teaching young warriors the difference between strength and brutality. And then she walked to Astrid's dwelling and found the young woman awake, as if she had been waiting. "I need to take a journey," Lagertha said without preamble. "Will you come with me?" Astrid looked at her, seeing what Lagertha hadn't said aloud, and nodded. Always. They took a small boat, just the two of them, and rowed out beyond the harbor, beyond the sight of land, into the open sea where the water stretched endlessly in all directions. The sun was high, the wind gentle, the sky the kind of impossible blue that made you believe in worlds beyond this. Lagertha shipped the oars and let the boat drift. She looked at Astrid, at this woman who had taught her more about strength than any battle ever had, and smiled. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what? For being brave enough to leave, for being brave enough to come back, for showing me that there are many ways to be strong, and that the way I had chosen wasn't the only one, wasn't even the best one." Astrid's eyes filled with tears. "You saved my life, Lagertha. Twice. Once from the flames, and once from myself. Everything I am, everything I've built, it started with you." "No," Lagertha said gently. "It started with you. I just carried you until you were ready to walk. That's all any of us can do for each other. Carry each other when we can't walk alone, and then let go when it's time." They sat in silence for a long moment, the boat rocking gently on the waves, the world reduced to sun and sea and sky. "I'm not afraid," Lagertha finally said. "I've faced death 100 times, but I am grateful for this life, for the battles I fought and the ones I chose not to fight, for the legend I built, and the one I tore down to build something better. For you." Astrid reached across the boat and took Lagertha's hand. "The halls of the gods are lucky to receive you, but we will be less without you." "No," Lagertha said, squeezing her hand. "You'll be exactly what you need to be. The sanctuary doesn't need me anymore. It never really did. It needs people who choose it, who build it, who believe in it. And you, all of you, are those people." She looked out at the horizon, at the line where sea met sky, and felt something settle in her chest. Peace. Not the peace of surrender, but the peace of completion, of a story told fully, of a life lived on her own terms, of a legacy that would outlive the songs and the legends because it was built on something more solid than glory. "Will you tell them?" she asked. "Tell them that Lagertha the Unbroken died on the open sea, where she belonged. Tell them she was not afraid. Tell them she chose this, as she chose everything, and tell them She paused, considering. Tell them that the greatest battle she ever won was learning when not to fight. Astrid nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Lagertha released her hand and stood carefully in the boat. She looked at the sun, at the sea, at the endless sky. She thought of her mother dying to protect their home. She thought of the warriors who had followed her, who had believed in her. She thought of the children in the sanctuary, learning to read, learning to build, learning that strength came in many forms. She thought of the girl she had been and the woman she had become, and found she had no regrets. The gods are waiting, she said, and I've kept them long enough. She stepped to the edge of the boat, and Astrid didn't try to stop her, because she understood, finally, that this was Lagertha's choice to make, her final act of sovereignty over her own story. Lagertha looked back once, meeting Astrid's eyes, and smiled. Then she stepped into the sea. The sanctuary mourned Lagertha's death, as all communities mourn the loss of their founders. But the mourning was not the wailing grief of those left helpless and directionless. It was the solemn acknowledgement of a debt paid, a lesson learned, a torch passed. Astrid told them what Lagertha had said, about the greatest battle being the one you chose not to fight. Some understood immediately, others took longer, wrestling with the paradox of a warrior who had found strength in laying down her sword. But eventually all of them understood, or at least understood enough. The sanctuary continued. It grew and changed and adapted, as all living things must. Some years were harder than others. Some leaders served better than others. Some challenges seemed insurmountable until they were surmounted. But the core of what Lagertha had built remained, a place where strength meant protecting rather than conquering, where courage meant facing your own brokenness rather than inflicting it on others, where legacy meant giving people the tools to build their own stories rather than forcing them into yours. Stories about Lagertha spread across the kingdoms. Some were true, many were exaggerated, a few were complete fabrications. She became, as all legends do, larger than life, and in becoming larger, became less human, more myth. But in the sanctuary, she remained exactly who she had been. Flawed and fierce, powerful and wounded, capable of great violence and greater mercy. The people who had known her told stories not of a perfect hero, but of a woman who had made mistakes and learned from them, who had been strong enough to admit when strength wasn't enough, who had built a legend and then had the courage to tear it down and build something better in its place. And on quiet nights, when the fires burned low and the children were asleep, the elders would tell the true story. Not of Lagertha the unbroken, but of Lagertha the shield, of a warrior who led 1,000 Vikings into battle, but won her greatest victory by choosing not to fight, of a woman whose heart sank when an enemy spoke her name, but rose again when she learned that some things couldn't be fixed with violence, of a legend who became more than legend by learning to be human again. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe and share in the comments what touched you the most. Your voice keeps these legends alive. Decades after Lagertha's death, a young woman arrived at the sanctuary. She was perhaps 18 winters old, with the weathered look of someone who had traveled far and the guarded posture of someone who had learned not to trust easily. She stood at the sanctuary's open entrance, staring at the buildings and the people moving between them with purpose and peace, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. An elderly woman approached her, Astrid, now silver-haired herself, her face lined but her eyes still bright with purpose. "Welcome," Astrid said. "Are you seeking shelter?" The young woman hesitated, then spoke. "I heard stories about a place where warriors could lay down their weapons, about a woman called Lagertha who built it. I didn't believe them, but I needed them to be true." "Why?" The girl's hand moved to her belt where a sword hung, a warrior's weapon, well used and well maintained. "Because I'm tired. I've been fighting since I was 10 winters old. I don't even remember what I'm fighting for anymore. I just know how to fight, and I'm so tired." Astrid smiled, and in that smile was an echo of another woman, another time, another tired warrior, learning that there were different kinds of strength. "Then you've come to the right place," she said. "Come, let me tell you about Lagertha, about what she built here and what she learned. about how the strongest thing a warrior can do is sometimes to simply rest. She extended her hand, and after a moment the young woman took it. Together they walked into the sanctuary, into the legacy that Lagertha had built, not with sword and shield, but with the courage to choose a different path, the courage to let go, the courage to build rather than destroy, the courage to believe that even warriors could heal, could change, could become more than the violence that had shaped them. The sun set behind them, painting the sanctuary in gold and crimson, and somewhere on the wind, or perhaps only in imagination, came the sound of oars cutting through water, of a boat carrying a warrior home to whatever gods waited beyond the horizon. And in the sanctuary that bore her legacy, life continued, not perfect, not without struggle, but filled with the quiet revolutionary act of people choosing day after day to be kind when they could be cruel, to build when they could destroy, to heal when they could wound. It was the legacy not of a legend, but of a woman who had learned that the greatest stories aren't the ones about never breaking, but about what you choose to build when you finally allow yourself to be broken, and then put yourself back together in a shape that serves not just your glory, but the world's need for hope. In the halls of memory, Lagertha still sails, not as the unbroken, but as the shield that welcomed all who needed shelter. And in sanctuaries built on her example, warriors still learn that strength comes not from never falling, but from choosing what to fight for, and when to lay the fighting down. May we all find the courage to build our own sanctuaries. May we all learn when to fight and when to shield. And may we all, in our own way, sail toward the horizon with peace in our hearts. Thank you for joining this journey until the next legend calls us home.